60 years ago, a young woman from a small textile factory in Yaroslavl agreed to something that no official document has ever fully explained. She was 26 years old. She had never attended university. She had learned to skydive in her spare time in the fields outside the city because she loved the feeling of falling toward the earth and trusting that something would catch her. Her name was Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova, and what happened to her between June 16th and 19th of 1963 remains, to this day, one of the most carefully buried secrets in the history of human civilization. You have been told the official story. Everyone has been told the official story. The Soviet Union, locked in a fierce competition with the United States of America, decided to send a woman into space before the Americans could. They selected Valentina from a group of 5 female candidates, trained her for 18 months, strapped her into the Vostok 6 capsule, and launched her into orbit. She circled the Earth 48 times over nearly 3 days, became a global icon, returned safely, and married a fellow cosmonaut in a ceremony that Soviet newspapers described as the wedding of the century. Simple, clean, triumphant, but that is only the official version, because the official version does not explain the 47 minutes of total silence. It does not explain the anomalies found in her blood upon return. Protein compounds that no Soviet or Western laboratory had ever cataloged. Markers that 3 independent researchers in later decades would describe, in hushed tones and always off the record, as non-terrestrial in origin. It does not explain the child, and it does not explain why, on the morning after Valentina's capsule splashed down in the Kazakh steppe, Sergei Korolev, the most powerful rocket engineer in Soviet history, a man who had survived Stalin's gulags and built the machine that launched Sputnik, reportedly sat alone in his office for 4 hours and refused to speak to anyone, not to his team, not to the Kremlin, not to his wife. Today, for the first time, drawing on declassified documents, personal testimonies, and archival material that Soviet authorities spent decades trying to suppress, we're going to tell you the real story of the Seagull. To understand what happened in orbit, you must first understand who Valentina was before the stars claimed her. She was born on the 6th of March, 1937, in the village of Maslenikovo in the Yaroslavl region. Her father, Vladimir Tereshkov, was a tractor driver. Her mother, Elena, worked on a collective farm. By all accounts, the family was poor in the particular grinding way that rural Soviet life could be poor. Not starving, but short of everything, perpetually borrowing warmth from neighbors and future from the government. When Valentina was 2 years old, her father was called up. It was the winter of the Finnish War. He drove into the cold and did not come back. The official notification said he had died in combat, but his body was never recovered. His name was never placed on a monument. He simply ceased to exist in any verifiable way, as if the earth itself had swallowed him. His daughter would spend the rest of her childhood drawing pictures of the sky, not the earth, not the village, not her mother's face, but the sky. By 1955, the family had relocated to Yaroslavl proper, and Valentina had found work at a tire factory, then later at the Krasny Perekop textile combine, operating a loom. She was a good worker. Her supervisors described her as disciplined and quiet. She joined the Young Communist League, attended meetings, gave speeches about productivity quotas, did everything a young woman was supposed to do in Soviet Russia. But on weekends, she drove out to the Yaroslavl Aero Club, pulled on a jumpsuit and threw herself out of airplanes. She made her first parachute jump in 1959, then another, then dozens more. She kept a logbook. She calculated trajectories. She was not doing it for sport. People who knew her at the time say she seemed to be practicing for something, though none of them could have said what. It was that logbook that eventually reached the desk of a Soviet recruiter scanning for candidates for a classified program. The program was called Group 5. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space. The Soviet Union erupted in celebration. But within the walls of Star City, the cosmonaut training facility outside Moscow, a quiet and entirely separate project had already begun. The official history says it was a propaganda initiative. Send a woman before the Americans do. Demonstrate Soviet equality. Win the ideological battle. And that was certainly part of it, but there is another layer. Among the classified documents that began emerging from Soviet archives in the 1990s, many of them only partially declassified with entire paragraphs redacted in black ink. There are references to a program designated only as Experiment Chaika, the Russian word for seagull. The program was not simply about selecting a female cosmonaut. It was about selecting a specific type of person. The criteria, as best as researchers have been able to reconstruct them, went far beyond physical fitness and ideological reliability. The candidates were evaluated for something the documents refer to as resonance capacity, a term that appears nowhere else in official Soviet aerospace literature. They were subjected to tests involving low-frequency sound patterns, prolonged sensory isolation, and what one partially visible document describes as response monitoring under conditions of non-standard signal exposure. What does that mean? Nobody in the official record will say, but 3 of the 5 female candidates dropped out of the program citing psychological distress. One reportedly told her family she had experienced visions during the isolation testing. Another requested a transfer to a different department and refused to discuss the reasons. Only 2 remained, a pilot named Valentina Ponomarova and the textile worker from Yaroslavl. The final decision was made not by the Cosmonauts Committee, not by the military, but by a 3-person panel convened at the personal request of Nikita Khrushchev. We don't know the names of all 3 panelists. We know that one of them was a physicist whose work had been classified since 1957. We know that the decision was unanimous. They chose Valentina Tereshkova, the girl who had grown up without a father, who had learned to fall toward the earth and trust that something would catch her, who had been drawing pictures of the sky since she was old enough to hold a pencil. They called her the Seagull. Every space mission generates a continuous data log. Telemetry, voice recordings, biometric readings from instruments attached to the cosmonaut's body, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, brain activity. Every second of a mission is documented. This is not merely standard practice. In the early 1960s, when the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in fractions, documentation was everything. You did not lose the data. You could not afford to. The Vostok 6 mission generated a continuous data log, except for 47 minutes on the first day of the flight. The official explanation offered by Soviet space authorities when researchers first began asking questions in the 1980s was a technical malfunction, a fault in the transmission equipment caused by an unusual configuration of electromagnetic interference in the ionosphere at that particular orbital position. It was, they said, a known risk. It had been logged. It was unremarkable, except that no other Vostok mission, not Vostok 1, not Vostok 2, not any of the others, experienced a comparable transmission loss of that duration or character. Except that the biometric instruments, which operated on a separate internal system with their own independent power source and did not rely on external transmission, also went dark during those same 47 minutes. Except that when the signal returned, 3 ground operators who were present in the control room that day later described, separately, in different years, to different people, the same experience. In the final seconds before communication was re-established, they heard something on the frequency. Not static, not noise, something structured, something that one of them, an engineer, named in declassified interview transcripts only by the initial K, described as a language he did not recognize but somehow understood to be a language. And except that when Valentina's voice finally returned to the speakers in the Baikonur control room, she sounded different, calm, deeply, unusually calm, as if she had been somewhere quiet for a long time and had not yet fully returned. She said, "There was an important conversation." Ground control asked her to repeat. She said, "I said there was an important conversation. Please continue with the scheduled program." Sergei Korolev, standing at the communications console, looked at the men around him. Nobody spoke. Then he picked up the internal telephone and made a call. Within the hour, all recordings from the 47-minute window had been removed from the standard archive and transferred to a classification level that, according to researchers who later attempted to access them, does not officially exist. The story you are about to hear crosses the boundary between what Soviet authorities permitted the world to know and what they spent decades trying to ensure the world would never discover. It involves a woman, a child, a silence in space, and a question that no government on Earth has ever officially answered. What did Valentina Tereshkova speak to 60 kilometers above the planet in 47 minutes that the instruments were not allowed to record? The official version says she orbited the Earth, came home, got married, and became a symbol. The real story says she was a young woman from a poor village who fell toward the sky and something up there caught her. Her call sign was Seagull, and the Seagull was not alone. The 16th of June, 1963 began before the sun. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Baikonur Cosmodrome was already alive with movement. Engineers in gray coveralls crossing the launch pad in the blue pre-dawn dark. Technicians running final checks on instruments that had been checked 3 times already. Military officers standing in clusters near the command building with their hands behind their backs, speaking in low voices that the wind carried away before anyone could hear them. The steppe stretched flat and enormous in every direction, and above it the sky was the deep, specific black that only exists in the hour before the world remembers it is supposed to be light. Valentina had slept 6 hours. She would later describe the sleep as unusually deep, not the restless, adrenaline-soaked sleep of someone about to be launched into orbit, but something closer to the sleep of a person who has already made peace with every possible outcome. She woke without an alarm. She lay still for a moment in the dark of her pre-launch quarters and looked at the ceiling and felt she would tell a close friend years later, as if she already knew how the story ended. She was dressed and ready before her handlers came to collect her. The Vostok 6 capsule sat on its launch assembly like a silver fist pointed at the heavens. It was a small machine by any standard, barely larger than a compact automobile, a sphere of aluminum and steel and ablative heat shield designed to do one thing: go up, survive, and come down. There was no room for error in its engineering. There was barely room for a human being. Valentina climbed in, settled into the ejection seat, and allowed the technicians to seal the hatch around her. At 12 hours, 29 minutes, and 52 seconds past midnight, Moscow time, the engines fired. The Seagull went to the sky. For the first several hours, Vostok 6 performed exactly as designed. Ground control tracked her trajectory with the precise, almost anxious attention that Soviet mission controllers always gave to crewed flights in those early years, when the technology was brilliant but young, and brilliance in rocketry sometimes expressed itself in catastrophic and sudden ways. Valentina reported her instrument readings at regular intervals, confirmed her physical status, described the view from the porthole with the kind of careful, factual language that cosmonauts were trained to use. She said the Earth was beautiful. She said it looked like it was glowing from the inside. She said the horizon was the color of a flame seen through blue glass. These were not in the standard mission script. Ground controllers noted the deviation, but did not flag it as concerning. She was the first woman in space. She was allowed a certain amount of poetry. On the first orbit, she passed over the Soviet Union, over Europe, over the Atlantic, over the Americas, and back again. The telemetry was clean. Her heart rate was elevated, but within acceptable parameters. Her oxygen consumption was normal. The capsule's systems were all nominal. At the completion of the first full orbit, Korolev himself came to the communications console and spoke to her. "How are you feeling, Seagull?" "I feel well," she said. "The view is extraordinary." "Good," he said. "Get some rest between scheduled contacts." She acknowledged and signed off. That was the last entirely ordinary moment of the Vostok 6 mission. It happened on the second orbit, approximately 90 minutes after the first contact report. At 9 hours and 14 minutes into the flight, Valentina's voice came through the speakers at ground control without being prompted. She was not scheduled to report for another 22 minutes. The transmission was clear, no static, no distortion, and her voice carried in it something that the operators in the room would later struggle to describe accurately. Not panic, not excitement. Something between the two, the specific alertness of a person who has seen something they were not expecting and is carefully deciding how to respond to it. Ground, she said. I am observing an object. The duty controller responded immediately. Clarify, Seagull. What type of object? A pause, 5 seconds. 10. It is a craft, she said, elongated, silver in color. It is maintaining a parallel course at a distance I estimate at approximately 300 to 400 meters. It is not tumbling. It is not decaying. It is holding a stable position relative to my capsule. In the control room, men looked at each other. There were procedures for equipment malfunctions. There were procedures for medical emergencies. There were procedures for communication failures and trajectory deviations and re-entry failures. There was no procedure for what Valentina Tereshkova had just described. The duty controller kept his voice level. Seagull, confirm, are you describing a natural object or an artificial one? Another pause, longer this time. It is giving signal, she said, light signals, a repeating pattern. 3 pulses, then a pause, then 2 pulses. It has repeated this pattern 6 times since I first observed it. Ground, it is looking at me. The control room went very quiet. Sergei Korolev, who had been standing near the back of the room reviewing trajectory calculations, put down his papers and walked to the communications console without a word. He took the headset from the duty controller, placed it over his own ears, and pressed the transmission key. Seagull, this is the chief designer. Describe the object in full detail. Valentina's description lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The object was elongated, she said, like a cylinder that had been slightly flattened along its horizontal axis. It had no visible propulsion system, no engine exhaust, no visible thrusters, no reaction mass of any kind. It moved with her, matching her orbital velocity with what she called effortless precision, the way a fish might match the current of a river without appearing to swim. Its surface did not reflect sunlight in the way that metal or glass reflects sunlight. Instead, it seemed to hold the light, as if the silver was not a color but a quality, something the object was, rather than something it had. The light signals continued throughout her description. 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, regular as a heartbeat. Seagull, Korolev said when she finished, are you experiencing any physical discomfort? No, she said. I am completely calm. Ground, I would like to respond to the signal. Korolev did not answer immediately. Around him, men were already moving, reaching for telephones, pulling covers off red communication lines that went directly to the Kremlin, speaking in whispers that were not quite whispers. One of the senior engineers pressed a button on the recording console. A younger technician who witnessed this moment would describe it years later. It was not the button that started recording. It was the button that stopped it. Seagull, Korolev said carefully, hold your current position and continue observation. Do not initiate contact. Repeat, do not initiate contact. Understood, she said. 40 seconds later, the signal went dead. At 9 hours, 26 minutes, and 11 seconds into the Vostok 6 flight, all communication with the capsule ceased. Not degraded, not distorted, ceased, completely and instantaneously as if someone had cut a wire. The telemetry stream, the continuous flood of biometric and systems data that ground control depended on to monitor the cosmonaut's survival, stopped in the middle of a data packet, mid-transmission. The signal did not fade. It did not break up into static. It simply stopped, and where the voice and data of a living woman had been, there was silence so total it had a texture, a weight, a presence of its own. For the first 8 minutes, the engineers assumed a technical fault. They ran diagnostics, checked relay stations, attempted contact on backup frequencies. Nothing. For the next 12 minutes, they escalated. Emergency protocols were activated. A second communication team was brought in. Senior military officers were called from other buildings. Still nothing. At the 20-minute mark, Someone quietly raised the question that everyone in the room had been refusing to think. What if she was gone? At 30 minutes, Korolev sent everyone except 6 essential personnel out of the room. He then ordered all external recording equipment switched off. The 6 men who remained in that room with him during the final 17 minutes of the silence have never, in any formal record, described what was said. 2 of them are dead. One emigrated after the Soviet collapse and has never spoken publicly about his time at Baikonur. The remaining 3, when approached by researchers over the years, have given identical responses. They say they remember very little about that period and change the subject. What is documented in a partially declassified memo written by Korolev himself and recovered from a secondary archive in the 1990s is this. At some point during the 47 minutes, the instruments that were internal to the capsule, operating on battery power, entirely independent of any external transmission system, recorded a temperature drop inside the cabin of 9 degrees Celsius. The drop lasted for exactly 31 minutes and then reversed. During the same window, the oxygen consumption readings showed a rate so low it was, as Korolev noted in the memo in his precise and unemotional engineering hand, inconsistent with a conscious living subject. She was not breathing, or she was breathing so slowly that the instruments could not distinguish it from not breathing at all. And then, at 47 minutes, the signal came back. The operators who were in the control room when communication was restored agree on the sequence of events, though they disagree on some of the details, in the way that people who have experienced something disorienting always disagree on details while agreeing on the essential shape of the experience. The signal returned at full strength, no gradual recovery. Full strength instantly, as if the 47 minutes had never happened, and Valentina's voice came through the speakers. It was her voice, the same pitch, the same accent, the particular slight flatness of vowels that marked her Yaroslavl origins. But something in the voice had changed. The operators reached for different words when describing it over the years. Slower, deeper, further away. One of them, the engineer referred to in transcripts only as K, said that it reminded him of how his grandfather had sounded coming home from the war. Not injured, not traumatized, but fundamentally altered in some way that had no name and required no explanation, because anyone who looked at the man could simply see that he had been somewhere that changed the structure of a person. Ground, Valentina said, I am here. The duty controller, his voice not entirely steady, asked for a status report. All systems are nominal, she said. I am in good health. Ground, there was an important conversation. I cannot tell you everything right now, but I want you to know that there was nothing to be afraid of, nothing at all. Korolev took the headset. Seagull, how long were you out of contact? A pause. I'm not certain, she said. It did not feel like a long time, but I think perhaps it was longer than the clocks say. This was the moment, confirmed in the partial Korolev memo, referenced obliquely in 3 separate personal accounts, when the mission controllers checked the Vostok 6 onboard chronometer against the ground station clock. The ground clock showed 47 minutes of silence. The capsule clock showed 9 hours and 53 minutes. The discrepancy was not a malfunction. Both instruments were later verified as functioning correctly. They had simply been measuring different things. Ground control spent the remainder of the second orbit attempting to reconstruct what had happened. They asked Valentina careful, indirect questions about the capsule's systems, about her physical state, about what she last remembered before the communication loss. She answered each question with the same calm, unhurried patience, confirming instrument readings, reporting her biometric status, cooperating fully. But she did not describe what had happened during the 47 minutes, not directly, not yet. It was on the 3rd orbit, 6 hours after the signal had been restored, that she said the thing that would be redacted from every official transcript for the next 30 years. Ground, she said, I would like to go visit them. Korolev was on the console. Clarify, Seagull. The ones I spoke with. She said, I would like to go to them. Is that possible? If the answer is no, then I understand, but I want you to know they are not far. And they are very patient. Korolev held the transmit key for 3 seconds without speaking. In the partial memo, he later described this moment as the most difficult pause of his professional life. Not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood with the specific precision of a man who had spent his life calculating trajectories exactly what the question meant. "No, Seagull," he said finally. "Stay on course. Complete the mission." A long silence from the capsule. Then, "Understood. But ground. They said if I cannot come to them, then they will come to me. I thought you should know." Korolev set down the headset. He picked up the red telephone on the console, the one that connected directly to the Kremlin. He waited for it to be answered. When it was, he said 4 words before anything else. "We have a situation." Valentina completed her mission. She orbited the Earth 48 times over 2 days, 22 hours, and 50 minutes. She landed in the Altai region on the 19th of June. The recovery teams found her standing outside the capsule in her orange flight suit, having already performed the standard post-landing checks, looking up at the sky. She was calm. She was healthy. Her biometrics, once instruments were applied, were all within normal parameters, with 3 exceptions that the doctors noted and then, apparently on instruction, removed from the standard medical report and placed in a separate file that was immediately classified. The exceptions were these: an elevated concentration of an unidentified protein compound in her bloodstream, which bore no resemblance to any known biological marker; a slight but measurable alteration in the electromagnetic signature of her neural activity, detectable only with instruments that were, at that time, experimental; and a body temperature that, when first measured, was 0.8 degrees below what it had been at launch, and which took 26 hours to fully normalize. The recovery team doctor who conducted the initial examination wrote a single sentence in his private journal that evening, a journal that his family donated to a university archive after his death in 1991 and that researchers only began examining in the mid-2000s. The sentence read, "She came back from somewhere I cannot name, and she brought something with her that has no name either." The Seagull had returned, but she had not come back empty-handed. The medical facility at Star City was not a hospital in any ordinary sense of the word. It occupied an entire wing of a building that did not appear on any public map of the cosmonaut training complex, accessible through a corridor that branched off from the main medical block behind a door marked with nothing more than a 4-digit number. The doctors who worked there had signed documents that, under Soviet law, made anything they saw inside those walls a state secret for the remainder of their natural lives. They were, by necessity and by selection, people who had learned to observe extraordinary things without allowing their faces to show that they were extraordinary. In the last week of June 1963, those doctors were tested. Valentina arrived at the facility 3 days after her landing in the Altai steppe. She had spent the intervening time in the standard post-mission quarantine, a protocol designed to ensure that cosmonauts returning from space had not brought back anything that Earth's immune systems were not prepared to handle. It was, in 1963, considered a largely precautionary measure. The early missions had shown no biological anomalies. The doctors expected nothing unusual. The first round of blood tests came back from the laboratory at 2 o'clock in the morning. The head physician, identified in partially declassified records only as Dr. V, a woman who had been part of the cosmonaut medical program since its inception, read the results at her desk under a single lamp in the specific silence of an institutional building at night when only the most essential personnel remained. She read them once. Then she read them again. Then she set the papers down, stood up, walked to the window, and stood there for a long time, looking at the darkness outside. Then she picked up the telephone and called a number that was answered on the first ring, regardless of the hour. She said, "We need a second opinion, and we need it immediately. And we need nobody else to know we're asking for it." The second opinion arrived the following morning in the form of a biochemist, whose name appears in the documents only as an initial, M. and who was brought from a research institute in Novosibirsk by military aircraft, told nothing about why he was needed, and shown only the test results without being told whose blood they had come from. He studied them for 2 hours. Then he said, "Where did this sample come from?" Dr. V told him it was classified. He said, "I need you to understand that these results are not possible. What I am looking at here does not exist in any catalog of known human biological compounds. These protein structures," he indicated 3 specific markers on the report, "are not of terrestrial origin. I do not know what they are, but I know what they are not." Dr. V nodded slowly. Then she told him about the other finding, the one she had not included in the initial report she had shown him, the one she had confirmed twice before she was willing to believe it herself. Valentina Tereshkova was pregnant. In any other circumstance, a pregnancy discovered 3 days after a space mission would have been unremarkable. Surprising, perhaps, given the timing, but biologically straightforward. Human reproduction follows patterns that medicine understood well by 1963: gestation periods, developmental rates, cellular markers. All of it was documented, predictable, known. What Dr. V was looking at was none of those things. The embryo's development, as measured by every available instrument, was proceeding at a rate approximately 1.5 times faster than any documented case in Soviet or international medical literature, at a stage where standard development would have produced a structure of a particular size and cellular complexity. What the instrument showed was significantly more advanced, not deformed, not abnormal in any pathological sense, simply ahead, as if whoever or whatever was growing inside Valentina Tereshkova had access to a different timetable than the rest of human biology. But it was the genetic analysis that stopped Dr. V's team completely. The laboratory at Star City had access to early genetic sequencing technology, crude by later standards, but sufficient to establish basic chromosomal profiles and identify the presence of known genetic markers. The analysis of the embryonic material took 4 days. When the results came back, 3 separate technicians verified them independently before anyone was willing to write them in a report. The material was human, predominantly, unambiguously, measurably human, but woven through the human genetic structure in patterns that the technicians described in their notes as deliberate rather than random, the way a signature is deliberate or a watermark, were sequences that matched nothing in any reference catalog, not a mutation, not a degradation. Not contamination of the sample, something additional, something that had been added to the human blueprint with a precision that the instruments could detect but not explain. Dr. V wrote in her private record, recovered decades later, a single clinical sentence followed by something that was not clinical at all. 30% of the embryonic genetic material is of unknown origin. I have no framework for this. I am not afraid, but I think I should be. The report went immediately and directly to one person, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. The meeting happened on the 4th of July, 1963, in a room in the Kremlin that was not a meeting room by official designation. It was a study, private and small, with dark wood paneling and a single window that looked out onto an interior courtyard where nothing grew. Khrushchev met with 4 people: his personal physician, the head of the Soviet space program's medical division, Korolev, and a man whose name has never been definitively established, but who appears in multiple accounts of this period as a senior intelligence official involved in what documents refer to only a special scientific liaison. The meeting lasted 3 hours. What was decided in those 3 hours can be reconstructed imperfectly from 3 sources: the partial Korolev memo, a second-hand account from a Kremlin aide who overheard fragments of a subsequent conversation, and a document recovered from the KGB archive in the 1990s that is heavily redacted, but whose visible passages align with the other 2 sources closely enough to give researchers reasonable confidence in the general outline. Khrushchev's first concern was containment. Whatever had happened to Valentina in orbit and whatever was now developing inside her could not become public knowledge. The implications were too vast, too destabilizing, too far beyond the boundaries of what Soviet ideology, or any earthly ideology, was equipped to process. The people of the Soviet Union had been told their cosmonaut was a hero of socialist progress. They had not been told she had come back from space carrying something that no Soviet biologist could explain. His second concern was the child, because Khrushchev, whatever his faults as a leader, was not a man who lacked imagination. He understood, and the documents suggest he understood it immediately, without needing it explained, that a child born of this particular origin was not simply a medical curiosity. It was a connection, a living link between what had happened on the second orbit of Vostok 6 and everything that might follow from it. That child, depending on what it turned out to be, was either the most dangerous thing in the Soviet Union or the most valuable, possibly both. His third concern was Valentina herself. She was not, Khrushchev insisted according to the partial records, to be treated as a problem. She was to be treated as a hero, which she was, and as an asset, which she had become, and as a human being who had done something that no one had asked her to do and that no training could have prepared her for. She was to be protected. She was to be cared for. And she was to be given, as much as the situation permitted, a normal life. A normal life required a normal explanation for a pregnancy. A normal explanation required a husband. Andrian Grigorievich Nikolaev was 33 years old in the summer of 1963. He was a cosmonaut. Vostok 3, the previous year, had made him famous, and by all accounts a serious, principled, fundamentally decent man who had grown up in a small Chuvash village not unlike the kind of place Valentina had come from. He was quiet. He was loyal. He was, by the specific measure that mattered most to the people who approached him, trustworthy in the particular Soviet sense of the word. Not naive enough to be dangerous, not cynical enough to be unreliable. He was called to a meeting in mid-July. The meeting was described to him as routine administrative business related to the cosmonaut program. He arrived in his uniform, sat down across a table from two senior officials, whose names he recognized and respected, and was shown a film. The film ran for 22 minutes. It contained the audio recordings from the 47 minutes of silence on Vostok 6, or at least selected portions of those recordings. It contained the medical report on Valentina's condition, summarized in terms that were clinical but not, Nikolaev later reportedly told a trusted colleague, easy to hear. And it contained a direct personal appeal from someone at the highest level of the Soviet government. The specific words in the account that has survived were, "Valya needs help. The state needs help. We are asking you to provide it." Nikolaev sat with the lights back on in the room for a long time without speaking. Then he asked one question. "Does she know I'm being asked?" He was told that she did. He asked one more question. "Is she well?" He was told that she was well and that she would remain well. He nodded once slowly in the manner of a man who has calculated a trajectory and found it acceptable. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. The wedding of Valentina Tereshkova and Andrian Nikolaev took place on the 3rd of November, 1963 in Moscow. It was, by Soviet standards, and by the standards of 1963 in general, a spectacular public event. Khrushchev himself attended the reception. The photographs, Valentina in white, Nikolaev in his cosmonaut uniform, both of them smiling the specific, bright, careful smile of people who are performing a feeling rather than experiencing one, were published in newspapers across the Soviet Union and around the world. Pravda called it the most romantic wedding in the history of the space age. Western wire services ran the photographs on their front pages. A French magazine described Valentina as the most beautiful bride in the world. Behind the public celebration, the arrangements were precise and thoroughly documented in the classified record. Nikolaev had been briefed on his role with the specificity of a mission briefing, which is to say, he knew exactly what was expected of him in what sequence and to what standard. He was to be a husband in every public sense of the word. He was to be present, attentive, and credible. He was not to ask questions that had not already been answered. He was not to discuss what he knew with anyone outside a list of 7 names. He was to understand that What he was doing was a service to his country of a kind that no medal could adequately recognize. He agreed to all of it, what the official record does not capture, and what survives only in fragmentary personal accounts, is the conversation that Valentina and Nikolaev had alone the night before the wedding, in a small room at the cosmonaut facility that had been arranged for precisely this purpose. They sat across from each other for 2 hours. What they said to each other in those 2 hours, nobody knows. But people who saw Nikolaev the following morning walking to the ceremony said that he looked like a man who had been given a burden he had not expected and had decided, without resentment, to carry it. And people who saw Valentina said she looked like a woman who had made peace with something much larger than a wedding. Pregnancy proceeded as the doctors had documented it would at its own accelerated rate. Valentina's condition was monitored with an intensity that went far beyond standard obstetric care. Daily examinations, continuous biometric recording, a dedicated team of 6 physicians who rotated through 12-hour shifts and reported upward through a chain of command that bypassed the standard medical hierarchy entirely and connected directly to the Kremlin. Every measurement, every reading, every observation was logged in a classified file that was updated in real time and to which access was restricted to fewer than 20 people in the entire Soviet Union. The doctors noted and carefully recorded the things that did not conform to expectation. The fetal heartbeat was measurably different in rhythm from standard human fetal cardiac patterns. Not irregular, not pathological, but operating on what one physician described as a different timing signature, as if the heart were counting in a system that used different intervals than the one human biology had settled on over millennia of evolution. The fetal brain activity, measured with the best available instruments of the era, showed patterns of complexity that the neurologist on the team said in a memo he later claimed to have written under duress were inconsistent with the developmental stage at which they were being observed. Valentina, for her part, was calm throughout, extraordinarily calm. She ate well, slept well, walked in the facility gardens every morning regardless of the weather, and read. She was reading constantly during this period, according to the nurses who attended her, working through books on astronomy, mathematics, linguistics, and the history of ancient civilizations, with a focused speed that the nurses mentioned in their reports not as a concern, but simply as an observation that seemed worth noting. She said very little about the pregnancy, except to the doctors who asked her direct clinical questions. But on one occasion recorded by a nurse who wrote it in her own private journal, and who is identifiable from the details as a woman who later emigrated to the West in the 1980s, Valentina placed her hand on her abdomen and said quietly to no one in particular, "She knows she's expected. She knows exactly when she's arriving." The due date as calculated by the accelerated developmental timeline was the 8th of June, 1964. On the morning of the 8th of June, 1964, Valentina woke at 6 o'clock, informed the attending nurse that the birth would occur at noon, ate a full breakfast, and spent the morning sitting quietly in her room. At 11:57, she went to the delivery room. At 12 o'clock precisely, not 12 o'clock approximately, not within a few minutes of 12, but at the exact moment that the clock on the delivery room wall completed its sweep to the vertical, a child was born. The delivery team consisted of 4 people. All 4 of them signed documents within 24 hours that classified their observations. All 4 of them are, as of the time of writing, deceased, but one of them, the most junior member of the team, a young obstetric nurse who was present entirely by coincidence, having been assigned to the facility only 2 weeks earlier and not yet fully briefed on the security protocols, wrote a letter to her sister the following day. The letter was intercepted by intelligence services, as all correspondence from the facility was intercepted and filed rather than destroyed. It sat in an archive for decades. When researchers first accessed it, the envelope had not been opened since the day it was filed. The nurse wrote, "I cannot tell you where I am or what I am doing, you know that, but I need to tell someone what I saw today. When the baby came, there was a light, not from any lamp, from the baby herself. Soft, like winter light through a curtain lasting only a few seconds. Everyone in the room saw it. Nobody said anything. The baby opened her eyes immediately. Not the unfocused eyes that newborns have, but eyes that were looking at something specific, at the ceiling, at a point above us all, with the expression that a person has when they recognize a face they have been missing. The child was given the name Elena, Elena Andrianovna Nikolaeva, bearing by the logic of Soviet convention the patronymic of the man who had agreed to be her father on paper. She weighed 3 kilograms and 400 grams. She measured 51 centimeters. By every external measure, she was a healthy, normal, beautiful newborn girl, except for the light, which lasted 11 seconds according to the delivery room clock, and which was never officially acknowledged, and except for the genetic report that was filed the following week, which confirmed what the prenatal testing had already suggested. 70% of Elena's genetic material was identifiably, measurably human. The remaining 30% was cataloged in the classified medical file under a designation that translated from its bureaucratic Soviet phrasing as origin unknown, non-terrestrial, hypothesis not excluded. And except for one more thing, noted by the senior physician in the delivery room in her clinical report, under the heading Additional Observations, in handwriting that is slightly less steady than the rest of the document. At approximately 12 minutes post-delivery, while the infant was being assessed, she produced a vocalization. This vocalization was inconsistent with standard neonatal reflexive sound production. It was structured. It was intentional. It was, in the opinion of this examiner, a word. The word, as best the physician could render it in Russian letters, was zvezda, star. Andrei Nikolaev visited the facility on the evening of the 9th of June, the day after Elena's birth. He was shown to the room where Valentina was resting, and he sat with her and with the child for 1 hour and 40 minutes. There's no recording of this visit and no written account from any of the parties present. But a nurse who passed the door twice during the visit reported later, in an interview conducted by a researcher in 2004, that through the closed door she heard, at one point, complete silence lasting several minutes. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of people who have nothing left to say because they have already understood everything. And then, very quietly, the sound of a man crying, not in grief. The nurse was careful about this distinction in the way that people who have spent their lives in medical settings learn to distinguish between kinds of weeping. Not in grief, she said. In something else. In the specific emotional register of a person confronting something so far outside the boundaries of what they believed was possible that the only available response is to abandon the boundaries entirely. He held the child for the remainder of the visit. When he left, the nurse saw his face in the corridor. He looked, she said, like a man who had just understood the size of the universe for the first time, shaken, but not frightened. Not frightened at all. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Whatever Andrei Nikolaev had agreed to do as a matter of duty had, by the time Elena was a week old, become something that required no agreement at all. Some things are simply larger than the arrangements made around them. There is a particular quality that people who knew Elena Nikolaeva as a small child consistently describe when asked about her, across decades and across the distance of memory that tends to soften and reshape what we think we remember. They reach for the same word or words that mean the same thing, regardless of when they were asked or how much time had passed. They say she was elsewhere, not absent. She was present, attentive, engaged, often the most engaged person in any room she occupied. But there was a quality to her attention that suggested she was receiving information from more than one direction simultaneously, as if the room you were in with her was not the only room she was in. She was, by every measure that mattered in a Soviet nursery, an exceptional child. She met every developmental milestone early, walking at 9 months, speaking full sentences before her 2nd birthday, demonstrating fine motor coordination that her pediatricians noted with quiet amazement, and then, following protocol, logged in the classified file rather than the standard medical record. She was healthy, strong, curious in the particular fearless way of children. who have not yet learned that some questions are supposed to go unasked. But the things she knew were the problem, not the things she had been taught, the things she knew before anyone taught her. By the time Elena was 5 years old, she was communicating fluently in Russian and in a second language that the monitoring team initially identified as a form of early German, based on certain phonetic similarities before a linguist brought in from Moscow State University spent 2 days with recordings of the child's speech and delivered a report that was immediately classified. The report stated that the second language Elena spoke was not German. It was not any Indo-European language. It was not, as far as the linguist could determine after exhaustive comparison with every documented language family in the available literature, any human language at all. It had grammar, consistent, learnable, rule-governed grammar of genuine structural sophistication. It had a vocabulary that appeared to be expanding over time, suggesting active acquisition rather than fixed programming. It had, the linguist wrote in the final paragraph of his report with the particular careful phrasing of a person who knows they are writing something that will be read by people with power over their career, the formal properties of a fully developed natural language, with the exception that it does not appear to have developed naturally, or here. Elena, when asked by a sympathetic nurse where she had learned this language, considered the question for a moment with the focused seriousness of a 5-year-old who understands that adults sometimes ask things they are not sure they want answered. Then she said, "From the voices that come when it is dark and quiet, they have been teaching me since before I could talk. I think they wanted me to be ready." "Ready for what?" the nurse asked. Elena looked at her with the dark, steady eyes that people who met her always remembered. "For when they come back," she said. "They said it would not be long." By the time she was 6, she had added a third language to her repertoire. This one was identifiably human, an archaic form of Sumerian that had not been spoken as a living language for approximately 4,000 years. A specialist from the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad, brought in under the pretense of a research consultation, spent an afternoon with Elena and emerged from the session gray-faced and silent. His written report, filed 3 days later, contained one sentence that the classification reviewers apparently found too stark to redact. "This child speaks Old Sumerian with native fluency. She also appears to understand aspects of the written system that scholars have been unable to decode for a century. I asked her about one undeciphered symbol. She said it meant the place where the counting begins. I have no further comment." The incident that the monitoring team came to refer to in their internal reports as the Jupiter event occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1971, when Elena was 7 years old. She was in the facility's small classroom, a sunny room with yellow walls and wooden desks that the staff had tried to make feel like an ordinary school because Valentina had insisted, with quiet but immovable firmness, that her daughter was going to have as normal an education as the circumstances permitted. A young teacher named Irina, who had been cleared for the posting and briefed on the security requirements, without being told very much about the specific nature of what she was dealing with, was conducting a science lesson on the solar system. The lesson reached Jupiter. Irina told the class, Elena was the only child, but the lesson was prepared as if for a group because Valentina believed structure mattered, that Jupiter was the largest planet in the solar system, and that it had, as far as scientists had determined, 12 known moons. Elena looked up from the paper on which she had been drawing. "That's not right," she said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone correcting a minor factual error. Irina, who was 24 years old and conscientious about accuracy, said that yes, 12 was the current scientific count and asked why Elena thought it was wrong. "There are 67, Elena said. "The ones you have not found yet are mostly very small. Some of them are irregular. That means they were captured. They did not form with Jupiter originally. There is a group of them at the outer edge that orbit in the opposite direction to the others. You will find them eventually. It will take a few more decades and better instruments." Irina wrote the number down in her lesson notes. Then she wrote a note to the monitoring team, as she had been instructed to do, for any observation she found unusual. The monitoring team checked the number 67 against every available source in the Soviet scientific literature. No publication, Soviet or international, had proposed a figure anywhere close to 67. The accepted count at that time was 12 confirmed moons, with a handful of others suspected but unverified. The number 67 was not confirmed by astronomers until 2012, when advances in telescope technology and computational analysis finally enabled a complete survey of Jupiter's orbital environment. Elena had been right by 55 moons in 41 years. The monitoring team's report on the Jupiter event concluded with a recommendation approved at the highest level that Elena's education be continued exactly as it was, with no changes, and that all future anomalous statements made by the child be logged, dated, and archived under a classification level that was, at that point, created specifically for this purpose. By the time Elena was 12, the classified archive dedicated to her observations had grown to several hundred pages. The monitoring team had developed a protocol for what they called forward statements. Things Elena said, usually in passing, usually with the offhand certainty of someone stating something that was simply obvious, that referred to events which had not yet occurred. The protocol required that each statement be logged with the exact date, time, and circumstances under which it was made, sealed in a secondary classification file, and reviewed only after sufficient time had passed to determine whether the statement had been accurate. The accuracy rate, as calculated by the review team in a summary document compiled in 1978, was documented as follows. Of 63 forward statements made by Elena between the ages of 5 and 12, 47 had been fully confirmed by subsequent events, 11 had been partially confirmed or were still pending, and 5 could not be assessed because they referred to events projected far enough into the future that no determination was yet possible. The 5 unassessable statements were not described in the summary document. They were moved to a file that required 2 separate authorizations to access, and which bore on its cover a notation that translated as long-range projection, do not evaluate before year 2000. Among the 47 confirmed predictions, 3 were considered in the summary document's understated official language particularly significant. The first was logged when Elena was 8. She had been looking out the window of the facility's garden room on a rainy afternoon and said, to no one in particular, that the wall was going to come down and that when it did, people would cry and then dance. When asked which wall she meant, she described with geographic precision the location of the Berlin Wall. This was 1972. The Berlin Wall would stand for another 17 years. The second was logged when Elena was 10. She told a monitoring team physician during a routine examination that there was going to be a fire at a city with a bird in its name, and that the fire would not be an ordinary fire, and that people would not understand for a long time how sick it had made them. She could not give a specific date, but said it would happen when she was a young woman. Chernobyl, whose name contains the Ukrainian word for a type of herb, but which monitoring team members retroactively associated with her description of a bird name via the word chorny, meaning black, as in blackbird, occurred in 1986. Elena was 22. The third was the one that disturbed the monitoring team most deeply because, unlike the others, it named not an event but a structure, a political structure that had defined the entire world in which they lived. Elena was 11 years old. She said, during a history lesson about the formation of the Soviet state, sitting at her wooden desk in the yellow classroom with the complete calm of someone reading from a text that already existed, it is going to end, not the country. Countries do not really end, but this version of it, with all the particular arrangements, is going to come apart. It will happen when I am in my late 20s. It will be strange and fast, and most people will not see it coming, but it will not be violent. It will be more like a door opening than like a wall falling. Irina wrote it down, sent it to the monitoring team. The monitoring team filed it. The Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991. Elena was 27 years old. Valentina was, throughout Elena's childhood, the fixed point around which everything else revolved. She was a mother in the fullest sense of the word, present, consistent, warm, in the specific, non-demonstrative way of people who grew up in circumstances where warmth was shown through action rather than declaration. She read to Elena every night until Elena was old enough to read to herself, and then for some years afterward, because both of them enjoyed the ritual. She taught her daughter to cook simple food, to mend clothes, to sit with difficult emotions without immediately trying to resolve them. She told her about Yaroslavl, about the textile factory, about the parachute jumps over the flat fields outside the city. She told her about her father who had gone into the winter and not come back. She did not tell her about the 47 minutes. She did not need to, because Elena, at 15 years old, on a September evening when the two of them were sitting in the facility garden after dinner, watching the first stars appear above the tree line, said to her mother, without preamble and without particular drama, as if continuing a conversation that had been ongoing for years, "I know who my real father is. He's been talking to me. He tells me about his world. It is very far away, but he says the distance is not as large as it seems because distance works differently where he is." Valentina did not respond immediately. The monitoring team's record of this conversation, obtained through the standard room audio surveillance that covered the garden, notes a pause of 1 minute and 40 seconds before Valentina spoke. When she did speak, she said, "What is his world like?" And Elena, her 15-year-old face turned up toward the emerging stars with an expression the surveillance note described simply as peaceful, said, "It is very old, much older than ours. He says they have been watching us for a long time and that most of what we think is history is actually something more like a conversation they have been having with us very slowly. He says we keep almost understanding and then getting distracted." Valentina looked at the same stars for a moment. Then she said, "Are you happy?" Elena turned to look at her mother with those dark, steady eyes. "Yes," she said. "I think I am exactly what I was supposed to be." In 1982, Elena enrolled at Moscow State University. The enrollment was, on the surface, entirely ordinary. She had completed a distinguished secondary education. Her academic record was exceptional. Her entrance examination results placed her in the top fraction of a %. She chose the faculty of physics and mathematics. Her professors, none of whom had been told anything about her background, found her to be one of the most remarkable students they had encountered in careers that had included, between them, a considerable number of remarkable students. What distinguished her, they said later, was not the speed of her comprehension, though that was extraordinary. It was the direction from which she arrived at conclusions. Most brilliant students, even the most original, worked within the established frameworks of their disciplines. They extended what existed, found new applications for known principles, identified errors, and accepted models. Elena did not work within the frameworks. She worked from outside them, arriving at points that were inside the frameworks via paths that nobody had mapped. When asked to show her work, she could always reconstruct a conventional proof after the fact. But her professors had the persistent, unsettling sense that the conventional proof was not how she had actually gotten there. In her second year, she requested access to the university's radio astronomy equipment. The request was granted. She used the equipment for 3 weeks, working alone in the early morning hours before other researchers arrived, analyzing a specific frequency range that she had specified in her access request. The technician responsible for the equipment asked her once, out of genuine curiosity, how she had known to look at that particular frequency. She said, "I recognized it. I have heard it before." The frequency she was analyzing was the same frequency at which the anomalous transmissions had been recorded during the Vostok 6 mission. The Vostok 6 mission logs were classified. Elena had never been given access to them. She had not been told the frequency. The technician included this detail in a routine maintenance report. The report reached the monitoring team within 48 hours. The monitoring team's senior analyst, who had been part of the program since Elena's birth, wrote at the bottom of his assessment of the incident, in the tired handwriting of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by individual data points and now only attended to their cumulative weight. She's not discovering. She is remembering. The event that occurred on the 14th of August, 1985, at 11:40 in the evening above the main quadrangle of Moscow State University was witnessed by 43 people, all of whom were debriefed within 12 hours, and all of whom signed documents that classified their observations under the program designation that had been created specifically for Elena's file. Of the 43 witnesses, 17 submitted written personal accounts as part of the debriefing process. The accounts vary in certain details but are consistent in their core description. An object appeared in the sky above the university. It was large. Estimates ranged from the size of a large building to the size of several buildings placed side by side. Though the difficulty of estimating scale against a dark sky means these figures should be understood as impressions rather than measurements, it made no sound. It exhibited no propulsive activity of any visible kind. It was there and then, it was there and then, with a finality that several witnesses described as somehow deliberate, as if it were making a point. It was not there. Elena was standing in the quadrangle when it appeared. She had been walking back from the library, alone. Several witnesses reported that she stopped walking when the object appeared and stood very still, her face turned upward, in the attitude of someone listening to something that the people around her could not hear. She stood that way for the duration of the object's presence, which the various witness accounts cross-referenced suggest was approximately 4 minutes. When the object left, Elena sat down on the nearest bench. A fellow student who had been among the witnesses approached her and asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. Then, after a moment, she said, "They came to say goodbye. They said that people are not ready yet. They said they will wait, but that the waiting has a limit and that the limit is closer than it looks." She was crying. The fellow student noted this carefully in his written account, as the only time he had ever seen Elena show an emotion that appeared entirely uncontrolled. She did not cry for long. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood up, straightened her jacket, and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "It is all right. They said I would understand when the time comes. They said I was built for the understanding." Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev had been General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for 5 months when he was informed in the autumn of 1985 that there was a young woman he needed to meet. The briefing that preceded the meeting took 3 hours. Gorbachev reportedly said very little during the briefing, asking only precise, direct questions and receiving the answers without visible reaction. He was, by every account, a man of considerable intellectual courage, capable of holding contradictory information in mind without the need to immediately resolve the contradiction, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable in a leader than almost any other quality. Elena was brought to the meeting in late October. The session lasted 2 hours and was not recorded by Gorbachev's personal instruction. What is known about the meeting comes from a single source, a handwritten note that Gorbachev made in a personal journal, discovered in his private papers after his death. A brief entry that reads in full, "Met today with the daughter of the Seagull. She's 21 years old. She's the most extraordinary person I have encountered in a life that has included many extraordinary people. She told me things about the future of this country that I hope are wrong but believe are right. She said the only way through is openness, complete openness. She said the structures we have built to protect ourselves have become the things most likely to destroy us. She said this not as a political argument, but as a simple statement of fact in the way you would tell someone that a bridge has a structural weakness. She said, be honest with your people before history's honest for you. I asked her how much time there was. She said, less than you want, more than you fear." Gorbachev announced the policy of glasnost, openness, the following year. Whether a 21-year-old woman with 30% non-terrestrial DNA sitting across a table from the leader of a superpower, in a room with no recording equipment, changed the course of Soviet history cannot be proven in any conventional sense. But the timing, as the monitoring team's senior analyst noted in the final report, he wrote before his retirement in 1987, has a quality that the word coincidence does not adequately describe. He suggested a different word. He suggested trajectory. There is a particular quality to the final days of a century. Not the calendar mechanics of it, the arbitrary human decision to measure time in units of 100 years, but the psychological weight that accumulates in people as the numbers approach a boundary that feels, regardless of its arbitrariness, like an ending. In December of 1999, that weight was everywhere. In Moscow, it sat in the gray winter air like something with density, something you could almost touch. The Soviet Union had been gone for 8 years. The country that had replaced it was still learning what it was. The man in the Kremlin was exhausted and unwell and had, in the judgment of people close to him, been exhausted and unwell for longer than anyone had been willing to say out loud. And above the major cities of the world, something was happening that the official channels were handling with a very specific kind of careful silence. The silence of institutions that have encountered something they do not have a framework for and have decided, as institutions always decide in these moments, that the absence of comment is preferable to the presence of an explanation they cannot complete. Beginning on the 3rd of December 1999, objects were observed in the skies above 7 cities simultaneously: Moscow, Washington, Beijing, London, Paris, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo. They appeared at night in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when observation is least likely and documentation most difficult. They were not identical in appearance, but shared certain consistent characteristics across all 7 locations. The silver quality of surface that Valentina had described 36 years earlier, above the curve of the Earth. The complete absence of sound. The unhurried precision of movement that suggested not mechanical propulsion, but something more like intention. They stayed for between 40 minutes and 2 hours at each location. Then they were gone. The official response in every country was the same: weather phenomena, atmospheric optical effects, mass misidentification of conventional aircraft. The explanations were delivered with the particular confidence of people who know the explanation's wrong, but have calculated that wrong and stable is preferable to right and destabilizing. But in the Kremlin, in the first week of December, Boris Yeltsin picked up a telephone and made a call. He called Valentina Tereshkova. The meeting between Boris Yeltsin and Valentina Tereshkova took place on the 12th of December, 1999, in a small private room adjacent to Yeltsin's personal office, a room that his staff used for meetings that did not appear on the official schedule. It lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. No staff were present. No recording was made. Valentina was 62 years old. She had spent the 3.5 decades since her flight navigating the complex, sometimes suffocating, always carefully managed life of a Soviet and then Russian public figure, giving speeches, attending ceremonies, sitting on committees, being the first woman in space in every public context while being in the classified context that ran parallel to her public life like a shadow, something considerably more complicated. She had done all of it with the same quality that people who knew her always described: the deep, particular calm of a person who has arranged a private understanding with the universe and no longer requires external validation. She arrived at the Kremlin alone, in a dark coat, carrying nothing. She left 4 hours and 17 minutes later, still carrying nothing, her expression composed and unreadable in the way that Valentina's expression had been composed and unreadable for 36 years. What was said in those 4 hours is not documented anywhere that researchers have been able to access. But Yeltsin's personal aide, who was present in the outer office throughout the meeting, and who gave an interview to a researcher in 2008 under conditions of anonymity, described the following. At some point approximately 2 hours into the meeting, Yeltsin opened the connecting door to the outer office and asked for water. His face, the aide said, was the face of a man who had been told something that had rearranged his understanding of his own place in history. Not frightened, not angry. something the aide reached for words to describe and finally settled on. He looked like a man who had just understood that a story he thought he was living in was much larger than he had known, and that his role in it was both smaller and more significant than he had imagined. Yeltsin took the water back into the room and closed the door. 19 days later, on the 31st of December, 1999, he resigned the presidency of the Russian Federation in a televised address that surprised virtually everyone who watched it, including most of his own government. In the address, he said, "I want to ask your forgiveness for the dreams that did not come true and for the things that seemed simple but turned out to be agonizingly difficult." He then did something that no one in the room and very few people watching had expected. He cried. Whether those words meant what their surface suggested, or whether they carried a second meaning that only one other person in Russia that evening fully understood, cannot be known with certainty. But Valentina, watching the address from her apartment, reportedly turned off the television when it was finished, sat for a while in the quiet, and then said to the empty room, "He understood." Elena arrived at Baikonur Cosmodrome on the afternoon of the 31st of December, 1999. She was 35 years old. She had spent the 14 years since the university event living what appeared, to anyone observing her public life, to be the life of a successful Russian physician. She had completed medical training, published research, maintained a modest professional profile that suggested competence without inviting particular scrutiny. The monitoring program, which had continued throughout this period with diminishing intensity as the structures of the Soviet state that had maintained it dissolved into the new Russia, had by 1999 reduced to a small team of 3 analysts working from an office in Moscow that still carried, somewhat absurdly given everything that had changed, the original classification designation created at Elena's birth. One of those 3 analysts was the son of the original senior analyst who had written the word trajectory in his retirement report. He had grown up hearing, in the careful fragmentary way that classified information leaks through families, and about the Seagull's daughter. He had requested the posting himself. He was 32 years old, and he had spent his entire professional life waiting for the chapter he sensed was coming. He was among the 11 people, all of them security and monitoring personnel, no press, no official government representation, who were present at Baikonur on the night of the 31st. Elena had requested access to the Cosmodrome through a channel that bypassed the standard administrative processes and connected directly to the intelligence service that maintained her file. The request was specific. She needed to be on the launch pad at midnight. She did not explain why. She had not explained things to the monitoring program in many years, having graduated at some point in her late 20s from subject of the program to something more like its senior consultant, a shift that had occurred so gradually that nobody had formally authorized it, but that everyone involved had simply accepted as the natural order of things. She stood on the launch pad at 11:55 in the evening in the specific cold of the Kazakh steppe in December, wearing a heavy coat and the same quality of expression she had worn looking up at the sky above the Moscow State University quadrangle 14 years earlier. The analysts stood at a distance of approximately 200 meters in the shadow of the service building, watching. At 11:59, the younger analyst noted in his log, which he was maintaining in real time, his hands cold around the pen, that the sky directly above the launch pad had changed, not dramatically, not with light or sound or obvious visual effect. The change was subtler than that, and he struggled to describe it accurately, even in the moment. He wrote, "The sky above her is different, as if the air there has a different texture, as if it is paying attention." At midnight precisely it came. Pasuri. The object that appeared above Baikonur Cosmodrome at midnight on the 31st of December, 1999, was not subtle. It was, by the estimates of the 11 witnesses present, enormous, larger than the launch assembly structure that was the tallest thing at the Cosmodrome, larger than any aircraft any of them had seen or could imagine. It made no sound. It produced no exhaust, no heat signature that the monitoring equipment detected No electromagnetic interference of any kind. It appeared the way a thought appears, not arriving from somewhere, but simply being suddenly and completely where it had not been before. Its surface was the silver that Valentina had described from orbit 36 years earlier. It held a light in the way she had described, not reflecting it, but containing it, as if the silver were not a color, but a condition. It hovered at a height the analysts estimated at between 200 and 300 meters above the pad. Elena did not look up when it appeared. She was already looking up. She had been looking up for several minutes before it arrived, in the attitude of someone who is not waiting for something to happen, but watching for something that is already in the process of happening. Then she rose. The younger analyst's log entry for this moment is written in handwriting that is noticeably different from the rest of the document. Larger, less controlled, the pen pressed harder into the paper. She's rising. No equipment, no mechanism. She's simply rising the way smoke rises, slowly and without effort, as if gravity has agreed to make an exception. She ascended approximately 40 meters before the light from the object's underside found her, and she became difficult to see, not because of any obstruction, but because the quality of the light around her changed in a way that made looking at her feel like looking at the sun, not blinding, but requiring a different kind of attention than the one the eye normally uses. And then she was inside. The object remained above the pad for another 2 minutes and 40 seconds after Elena disappeared into it. The analyst did not speak during this time. There was nothing to say. The younger analyst had stopped writing in his log. He held his pen above the paper, but produced no words. Then the object was gone, in the same way it had arrived, not leaving, not departing, not moving away in any direction that the eye could follow, simply ceasing to be where it had been. The launch pad was empty. Baikonur's vast floodlights buzzed in the cold. Somewhere in the distance, across the steppe, a new century was beginning. Elena Nikolaeva was absent for 7 days. During those 7 days, the monitoring team's 3 analysts maintained continuous rotation at the Cosmodrome. They did not leave. They ate from the facility canteen, slept in the security personnel quarters in shifts of 4 hours, and maintained a log of continuous observation of the launch pad that, for 7 days, recorded nothing except weather, temperature, and the movements of Cosmodrome maintenance staff, who had been told only that the area was under a temporary security protocol. The 3 analysts spoke very little to each other during those 7 days. They had, each of them, their own relationship with what they had witnessed and with what its meaning might be. And those relationships required the kind of quiet that cannot accommodate conversation. On the 4th day, the senior of the 3, a woman named Elena, who had been part of the program for 15 years and who was, among the 3, the most methodical and the least given to anything resembling speculation, wrote a single line in her personal notes. Either she's coming back or she's not. If she comes back, everything changes. If she does not come back, we have been watching over the most significant story in human history, and we are the only people who will ever know it. She paused, then added, "Either way, I think we are privileged to be here." On the morning of the 8th of January, 2000, at 6:43 in the morning, Elena walked through the security gate of Baikonur Cosmodrome. She was on foot. She came from the direction of the launch pad, crossing the open ground between the pad and the gate in the gray early light with the unhurried walk of someone who has been somewhere for a long time and is now arriving somewhere familiar. She was wearing the same coat she had been wearing when she rose from the pad on New Year's Eve. It showed no damage, no weather, no indication that it had been worn for 7 days in any environment, not the Kazakh winter, not whatever other environment it had been worn in. She was carrying nothing. Galina met her at the gate. Elena looked at her for a moment with the dark, steady eyes that people had been noting since her first minutes of life. There was something different in them now. Not new, exactly, but more present, as if something that had always been in her had moved from the background to the foreground, and was no longer making any effort to be subtle. "Are you well?" Galina asked. "Yes," Elena said. "I am very well." She paused. "I have messages. For several people, I need to begin making arrangements. Elena nodded slowly. How was it? Elena considered the question with the genuine thoughtfulness she gave to everything. It was like coming home, she said, and also like understanding for the first time that home is much larger than the place you grew up in. While Elena was absent, the younger analyst, who had been in the 7 days of waiting the most methodical of the three in the sense that work was his response to the uncontrollable, had used the time to complete a project he had been assembling for 3 years. He had been quietly, carefully, and entirely unofficially building a parallel archive. The GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, had been run for decades by General Pyotr Ivashutin, who served as its director from 1963 to 1987. Ivashutin was a meticulous man who believed with the conviction of a lifetime in intelligence work that everything should be documented and that nothing should be destroyed. Under his direction, the GRU had maintained files on the Vostok 6 anomaly from the beginning, separate from the cosmonaut program's own classified records, cross-referenced with intelligence reports from Western sources that had detected anomalous activity during the same orbital window. When the Soviet Union dissolved, these files had not been destroyed. They had been moved to a secondary storage facility in a building outside Moscow that had changed its institutional affiliation 3 times since 1991 and whose current designation was sufficiently ambiguous that a determined researcher with the right contacts could obtain access on the basis of an administrative misunderstanding that would take long enough to correct to be useful. The younger analyst had done exactly this. What he found in the Ivashutin archive was organized with the precision of a general who had understood that he was documenting something that would eventually need to be understood by people working in very different circumstances from the ones in which the documents were created. There were photographs. The most significant photograph was a single image, 11 centimeters by 14 centimeters, printed on the heavy photographic paper of the early 1960s. It showed the Vostok 6 capsule, clearly identifiable by its distinctive spherical shape, and the mission markings visible on its surface, in orbit above the Earth. The image had been taken by what was labeled in the archive's index as a surveillance satellite camera with exceptional resolution capability, which was itself a classified asset whose existence was not publicly acknowledged. In the image, at a distance from the capsule that the archive's technical appendix calculated at approximately 350 meters, there was something else, elongated, silver, hovering with the precise, effortless stillness of something that had not gotten there by any means that the laws of physics as understood in 1963 could explain. Exactly as Valentina had described it, the photograph had been taken at 9 hours and 12 minutes into the Vostok 6 flight, 2 minutes before Valentina's unscheduled transmission in which she first reported the object. It had been classified at the highest available level within hours of processing and had remained classified for 37 years. There were medical documents. The Ivashutin archive contained a complete copy of the medical file on Valentina's post-flight examination, including the portions that had been removed from the version held by the cosmonaut program's own medical division. The complete version contained 3 additional appendices. The first described in clinical detail the non-terrestrial protein compounds found in her blood. The second was a technical analysis of the electromagnetic anomalies in her neural signature. The third was a verbatim transcript of an interview conducted with Valentina herself on the 28th of June, 1963, 9 days after her landing, in which she described for the first and only time in any official context what had happened during the 47 minutes. The transcript was 43 pages long. It was the most classified document in the archive. The younger analyst read it in a single sitting in a chair in the storage facility, with the specific quality of attention that people give to things they know they will only encounter once. He did not include the full transcript in his parallel archive. He included a summary, 3 pages, single-spaced, that described in outline what Valentina had told her interviewers, and there was the Politburo stenogram. The Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union met in extraordinary session on the 17th of July, 1963, 4 weeks after Valentina's landing, 2 weeks after the initial medical findings had been presented to Khrushchev. The session was attended by 11 full members of the Politburo and 4 candidate members. Korolev was present as a technical advisor. The meeting lasted 6 hours and 20 minutes. The stenographic record of this meeting, taken by a secretary who was, according to a footnote in the Ivashutin archive, subsequently transferred to a posting in Siberia for reasons described as administrative restructuring, and who never worked in a sensitive capacity again, ran to 112 pages. The younger analyst found 17 pages of it in the archive. Whether the remainder had been destroyed or was filed elsewhere in a location he had not accessed, he could not determine. But the 17 pages covered what appeared from context to be the central portion of the meeting, the portion in which the substantive decisions were made. Khrushchev opened this portion of the meeting, according to the stenogram, with words that the younger analyst underlined 3 times in his notes. They made contact. They initiated. They offered what the technical people are calling a proposal for cooperation. I want to be clear about what this means. We did not find them. They found us, and they specifically chose the woman. There was a recorded pause in the stenogram, indicated by the notation, silence, duration, approximately 2 minutes, before discussion resumed. Anastas Mikoyan, the longest-serving member of the Politburo, asked the first question. What form does the cooperation take? Khrushchev described, in terms that the stenogram rendered in careful bureaucratic language, the essential content of what Valentina had communicated in her 43-page interview, that the contact had established certain foundational facts about the nature of the relationship between the visitors and humanity, that it had included what Valentina described as an exchange of understanding rather than a transaction of information, and that the visitors had indicated a willingness to continue engagement under conditions that they had specified and that Valentina had conveyed. Then Leonid Brezhnev, who would succeed Khrushchev as leader the following year, spoke. His contribution to the stenogram was one sentence that the younger analyst read 4 times before writing it in his notes. The pregnancy is the most significant fact. If we understand what we are dealing with correctly, then the child is not a complication. The child is the message. The remaining pages of the stenogram covered the practical arrangements that followed from this framing. The marriage, the classification protocols, the medical monitoring program, in the dry, detailed language of bureaucratic implementation. But they also contained in the final pages a reference to something else, a physical object. In the late 1960s, according to the Ivashutin archive, a metal plate approximately 20 centimeters by 12 centimeters was delivered to Soviet authorities through a channel that the archive described only as established contact protocol, suggesting that by this point some form of ongoing communication had been formalized, though the details of how this worked were not in the portion of the archive the younger analyst had accessed. The plate was composed of a material that Soviet metallurgical analysis could not definitively classify. It shared certain properties with known alloys, but was not identical to any of them, and its structural characteristics at the atomic level were, according to the analysis report, inconsistent with any manufacturing process available to current human technology. On its surface were markings. The markings were not random. They had the organizational logic of language. Repeated elements, apparent grammatical structure, evident meaningful units that recurred in varying combinations. Soviet linguists, cryptographers, and mathematicians worked on the markings from 1968 to 1974 without producing a decipherment. The project was temporarily suspended in 1974 when the lead researcher retired and his successors concluded that the available analytical tools were insufficient for the task. The plate was placed in secure storage. In 1978, a 10-year-old girl named Elena, during a visit to the facility where it was stored, a visit arranged as part of the monitoring program's ongoing assessment of her developing capabilities, was shown the plate. She looked at it for approximately 3 minutes. Then she began to describe what it said. She spoke for 40 minutes in the careful, methodical way she did everything, while a stenographer recorded her words, and 2 monitoring team members sat across the table from her and maintained the expressions of people who are professionally required to react to extraordinary things with measured calm and are finding this requirement more demanding than usual. The plate, Elena explained, contained coordinates, not spatial coordinates in the conventional navigational sense, but something more complex, what she described as a position across multiple variables simultaneously, only some of which were physical location. It also contained a timetable, and it contained what she called conditions, not demands or threats, but something closer to the terms of an agreement that had been offered and was waiting to be accepted. She read the timetable carefully. She described its key points. Then she looked up at the monitoring team members across the table and said, with the directness of a child who has not yet fully learned the adult habit of softening difficult information, "The last date on here is in 2030. That is when the offer expires. After that, they said, they will still be there, but the specific arrangement they are proposing will not be available in the same form." She paused. "We have time," she said, "but not as much as people think." On the 8th of January, 2000, Elena sat in a room at Baikonur with Galina, the younger analyst, and the 3rd member of the monitoring team, and spoke for 3 hours. She spoke with care and in sequence, as if delivering a prepared report, which, in a sense, it was. She had had 7 days to organize what she needed to say. She had organized it well. She described where she had been in terms that were careful and specific about the things she was permitted to convey, and deliberately limited about the things she was not. She had been, she said, in a place that was not a physical location in the way that Earth is a physical location. It occupied space, but space worked differently there, and the human brain's spatial intuition, optimized for navigating a world of 3 dimensions at low velocities, was simply not equipped to form accurate pictures of the environment. What she could say was that it was inhabited, that it was very old, and that the beings she had met there were not strangers to her. She had, she said, met her father. She described this without visible emotion in the same measured voice she used for everything, though the younger analyst noted in his log that her hands resting on the table were very still in the way, that hands are very still when a person is using concentration to keep them that way. Her father had sent a message for Valentina. Elena had memorized it exactly as she had been asked to do. She would deliver it in person. It was private, and she would not share it with the monitoring team. She had also been given, she said, messages for the leaders of the major spacefaring nations, not demands, not ultimatums. What she described as conditions of contact, a framework for how the relationship between human civilization and the civilization that had found Valentina above the Earth in 1963 could proceed toward something more open, more mutual, and more honest than the classified bilateral arrangements that had characterized it for the past 4 decades. The framework had stages. Each stage had a timeline. The first stage was already underway, she said, and had been for several years. The gradual, structured emergence of information into the public domain through channels that could be acknowledged without requiring immediate, complete disclosure. The later stages would come faster. She placed a document on the table. It was handwritten in Elena's precise and distinctive script on paper that was entirely ordinary. She had written it, she said, at Baikonur during the hours after her return, before coming to meet the team. It outlined the framework in terms that could be understood and transmitted. The younger analyst looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Elena. "How do we know it will work?" he asked. "The world is not the same place it was in 1963. The structures are different. The people with authority to act on something like this are not the same kind of people. How do we know they will listen?" Elena looked at him with the expression that people who met her always remembered, the dark, steady eyes that had been looking at things from a specific distance since they first opened in a delivery room in 1964. "We do not know," she said. "That is what makes it meaningful." If it were certain, it would not require courage. They know that. They have been watching long enough to understand that the most significant things human beings have ever done were the ones they did without certainty. She paused. They have a great deal of respect for it, she said. I think that is the thing I most wanted to come back and tell people. After everything, all the classification, all the secrets, all the decades of managing and containing and being afraid of what would happen if people knew, they have a very great deal of respect for us. She stood up and put her coat on. Now, she said, I need to go see my mother. The morning after 7 days, Valentina was in her apartment in Moscow when the knock came. It was early. The light through the curtains was the thin, pale light of a January morning that is not yet decided whether it intends to be day or merely a gray extension of the night that preceded it. She had been awake already. She had been awake, in fact, for most of the 7 days, in the particular way of a person whose body insists on sleep but whose mind refuses to fully commit to it. She had eaten small amounts. She had walked in the mornings along the embankment in the cold with her hands in her pockets and her face turned toward the river. She had not watched television or read newspapers. She had waited in the specific disciplined way that she had learned, somewhere between Yaroslavl and orbit, between 26 and 62, to wait for things that could not be hurried. When she opened the door and saw Elena standing in the corridor, she did not speak immediately. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, at the dark eyes, at the coat that showed no sign of where it had been, at the expression on Elena's face that was, Valentina would later say to the one person she ever described this moment to, the expression of someone who has been to the place you have always wondered about and has come back to tell you it is real. Then Valentina stepped back from the door and let her daughter in. They sat together in the small kitchen, the same kitchen where Elena had grown up eating breakfast, where Valentina had read to her at the table, where ordinary life had conducted itself in parallel with everything extraordinary. And Elena delivered the message. The message itself has never been recorded and never will be. It was private in the absolute sense of the word, between a woman who had agreed to something vast on a June morning in 1963 and the being who had, from an altitude of 300 meters above the earth, chosen her. What is known is that Valentina listened to the message without interrupting, and that when Elena finished, Valentina sat quietly for a while and then nodded once, slowly, in the way that she had nodded at moments of great significance throughout her life, not with resignation, but with the specific dignity of someone confirming an understanding that they had carried for a long time and were glad finally to have confirmed. Then she said, "Tell him I kept my promise." Elena spent the first 3 months of the year 2000 traveling. She traveled to Washington, to Beijing, to London, to Paris, to New Delhi, to Sao Paulo. She traveled quietly, without announcement, through channels that bypassed the standard diplomatic machinery, and connected instead to people who had spent varying portions of their careers maintaining, in their respective countries, the classified awareness of what had begun on the second orbit of Vostok 6. These people existed in every major government, not as a coordinated network, but as parallel developments, individual officials and scientists who had encountered the evidence and been given, along with classification obligations, the specific psychological burden of knowing something that the rest of the world did not. Elena met with each of them. She delivered the framework she had brought back from her 7 days. She answered questions with the same patient precision she had applied to everything since childhood. She was careful to establish in every meeting an ambassador in any political sense. She was not representing a government or negotiating on behalf of a state. She was a bridge in the most literal possible sense, a structure built to allow passage between two places that could not otherwise easily reach each other. The framework she delivered had at its core a simple principle that she articulated in the same words in every meeting in whatever language the meeting was conducted in: gradual, verified, mutual. Gradual because the scale of the disclosure required time for human institutions to adapt. Verified because trust between civilizations, like trust between individuals had to be built on demonstrated honesty rather than claimed honesty. And mutual because the relationship being proposed was not one of teacher and student or protector and protected, but of two civilizations that had, through a remarkable chain of events beginning with a textile worker from Yaroslavl, found each other. The responses she received varied. Some officials were resistant in the way that people who have managed secrets for decades become resistant to the idea that the secrets should end. Some were eager in ways that Elena had to temper, the eagerness of people who imagined that disclosure would resolve the world's problems rather than simply adding a new dimension to them. Some were frightened, some were moved to something that looked across the table from Elena's steady dark eyes, very much like relief. The relief, she told the younger analyst in one of their regular communications during this period, was the response she had expected and the one she found most significant. People are tired of not knowing, she wrote. They sense, without being told, that the official story has edges that do not quite fit together. The relief is not about what they are being told. It is about being told at all, about the end of the pretending. Plan, as Elena had delivered it, specified the period from 2024 to 2030 as the window for structured sequential public disclosure. The first element of this phase arrived on the 15th of May, 2024. On that date, in a meeting that had been arranged through back channels over the preceding 18 months, the leaders of 7 nations, Russia, the United States, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, and Brazil, signed a document in a room in Geneva that did not appear on any official government calendar. The document was not a treaty in the legal sense. It had no ratification process, no legislative review, no public announcement. It was, as the lead negotiator, a French diplomat who had been working toward this moment for 11 years, described it in his private journal. An agreement to begin telling the truth in stages at a pace that we believe the world can receive. The document established a timeline, a protocol for verification, a framework for responding to the public questions that would inevitably follow, and a shared commitment to avoiding the narrative of threat that classified programs in every country had reflexively constructed around the subject for 6 decades. Elena was present at the signing as the only non-governmental participant. She signed nothing. She witnessed everything. Afterwards, standing in the corridor outside the room while the diplomats exchanged the careful formal courtesies of their profession, she was approached by the American representative, a man who had spent 30 years in the intelligence community and who had, in that time, developed a quality of directness that he applied equally to foreign adversaries and to reality itself. He said, "I have one question I need to ask you." She waited. All of this, the framework, the timeline, the conditions, was this their idea or yours? Elena considered the question for a moment. Both, she said. That is what it means to be a bridge. You carry the weight from both sides. In the spring of 2025, in a facility outside Novosibirsk, whose official designation described it as an atmospheric research station, a team of 31 scientists and engineers conducted a test. The test lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The device they were testing was a propulsion system, not a rocket. There was no combustion, no exhaust, no reaction mass of any kind. The operating principle of the device had been developed over 5 years of work by a team that included, among its members, 3 physicists whose theoretical frameworks had been derived through a chain of inference and interpretation that they were scrupulously honest about in their internal documentation from the technical information Elena had been transmitting to scientific contacts since the early 2000s. The device was attached to an unmanned test vehicle approximately the size of a small bus. At 11 o'clock in the morning on the 17th of April, 2025, the test vehicle rose from the facility's test pad, climbed to an altitude of 500 kilometers, well above the boundary of Earth's atmosphere, into the region of low Earth orbit, and returned to the pad without any form of conventional propulsion. The flight lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The fuel consumption was zero. The team lead, a physicist named Dr. Anastasia Voronova, who had been working in the field for 20 years and who was, at 53, old enough to have begun her career in the Soviet scientific system and young enough to have rebuilt herself entirely in the post-Soviet one, stood on the pad after the vehicle returned and looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to her team, who were standing in a cluster behind her, very quiet in the way that people who have just witnessed something irreversible are quiet. "Well," she said in the flat, practical Siberian accent she had never lost, "that changes things. It changed things in ways that took months to begin processing, not the scientific implications, which were enormous, but the human ones. Because a propulsion system that required no fuel did not only mean faster space travel. It meant travel to places that had previously been defined primarily by how long it would take to reach them and how much resource it would cost and how many people would not survive the journey. It meant that the solar system, which had been theoretical territory for all of human history except the thin sliver of it accessible by rocket, was now something else. It was for the first time a neighborhood. On the 14th of August, 2025, the 40th anniversary of the night the object had appeared above Moscow State University, a coincidence that Elena acknowledged with a small smile when a journalist pointed it out. Valentina Tereshkova gave an interview. She was 88 years old. She sat in a chair in her apartment in Moscow, in a room with bookshelves and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where something grew in summer, and she spoke for 3 hours to a camera that broadcast simultaneously via satellite, to a global audience that the subsequent viewership count would establish at 2,140,000,000 people, the largest single audience in the history of television. She was, for the first hour, the Valentina the world knew, the first woman in space, the Seagull, the girl from Yaroslavl, who had jumped out of airplanes because she loved the feeling of the sky. She told these stories with the warmth and precision of someone who has told them many times and still means them. In the second hour, she told a different story. She told it in the careful, sequential, factually grounded way of an engineer or a navigator, someone who has spent a lifetime working with instruments that require accuracy and who has developed from this work a constitutional aversion to imprecision. She described the silver object. She described the 47 minutes. She described the conversation, as much of it as she had been given permission to disclose at this stage of the timeline. She described the months that followed, the medical findings, the child, the marriage that was an arrangement before it became something real, the decades of monitoring and classification, and the particular loneliness of knowing something that the rest of the world was not yet ready to hear. She was not angry about the secrecy. She was asked this directly by the interviewer, and she considered it for a moment before answering. "I understood it," she said. "I did not always agree with every decision that was made, but I understood the fear that drove those decisions. People are afraid of what they cannot place. I was afraid too at first, and then I was not, and then I spent 60 years waiting for the world to arrive at the place I had arrived at." She paused. "It takes longer than you think," she said, "and then it happens faster than you expected." In the third hour, she spoke about Elena. She spoke about a child who had said her first word at 12 minutes old and had spent her life being exactly what she was supposed to be, without complaint and without performance, simply going about the work of being a bridge between two worlds that needed, more than anything, to stop being afraid of each other. She spoke about her father, Vladimir Tereshkov, who had driven into the winter in 1939 and never come back, and about the strange symmetry of a life that had begun in that loss and moved through a parachute club in Yaroslavl and 3 days in orbit toward a discovery that made the distances between things, between people, between worlds, between what is known and what is possible, feel, if not small, then at least navigable. She spoke about what it felt like on that second orbit when the silver object appeared at 350 meters and began its patient, 3 pulse pause, 2 pulse rhythm. I was not afraid, she said, for the 2,140,000,000 people watching. I want people to understand that. I have been asked many times how I felt in that moment, and I have always had to be careful about my answer because the classified answer and the true answer were the same answer, and I was not yet allowed to give it, but I can give it now. She looked directly at the camera with the expression that people who knew her recognized, the deep particular calm of a person who has arranged a private understanding with the universe. I felt that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, she said. I felt that everything that had happened in my life, the village, my father who did not come back, the factory, the parachutes, the training, all of it, had been leading to that moment, not because it was planned, because that is how life works when you are paying attention. Everything leads somewhere. The question is whether you are willing to go. On the 3rd of March 2026, a spacecraft lifted from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Its designation was Tereshkova 1. It was not large by the standards of the vessels that had been described in the classified communications of the preceding years. It was, by those standards, a prototype, a first step, a demonstration of principle, but it was larger than any crewed spacecraft previously launched by any nation, and it carried within its hull a propulsion system derived from the technology that Dr. Voronova's team had demonstrated the previous April. On board were a crew of 8, scientists, engineers, a physician, a geologist, and a pilot who had trained for 4 years in systems that had not existed when she was selected for the program, and one other person. Anna Nikolaeva was 24 years old. She was Elena's daughter, Valentina's granddaughter, and she had inherited from the specific genetic arithmetic of her lineage the dark, steady eyes and the quality of attention that people who met her described in exactly the same terms that people had used for Elena at 24 and that people had used for Valentina at 26, standing at the base of a rocket on a dark Baikonur morning with the certainty of someone who already knows how the story ends. She had qualified as a mission specialist on the basis of her documented expertise in exobiological systems, a field that had expanded rapidly in the preceding years as the structured disclosure process made available through carefully managed releases to the scientific community, theoretical frameworks that advanced Earth science by decades in the specific areas most relevant to what was coming. Anna had been 6 years old when her grandmother gave the interview. She had watched it sitting beside Elena in Valentina's apartment on a screen set up in the living room for the occasion. She had listened to her great-grandmother's voice, steady and precise and warm, describing the 47 minutes and the silver object and the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. At the end of the interview, Anna had turned to Elena and said, with the directness of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned the adult habit of leaving certain things unsaid, "Is that going to happen to me too?" Elena had looked at her daughter with the dark eyes. "Something is," she had said. Something always is in this family. On the 18th day of the Tereshkova 1 mission at 11:42 in the morning Moscow time, the spacecraft achieved Mars orbit. The journey had taken 18 days. Every previous calculation based on conventional rocket propulsion had placed the minimum transit time for a crewed Mars mission at between 6 and 9 months under optimal conditions. 18 days was not a refinement of those calculations. It was a different kind of mathematics entirely, the mathematics of a propulsion principle that did not work within the same constraints. The crew spent 14 days in Mars orbit conducting observations and deploying surface instruments. Then they came home. The return journey took 17 days. Anna sent one personal message during the transit to Elena, which was not classified and which was released as part of the mission's public communications. It read, "It is very beautiful out here. I keep thinking about the village in Yaroslavl and about a young woman who jumped out of airplanes and then jumped further. Everything leads somewhere. Tell great-grandmother I am paying attention." The station designated most. Bridge had been under construction in low Earth orbit for 3 years when it was declared ready on the 1st of June 2030. It was not the largest structure humanity had ever built, but it was the most significant in the specific sense that significance has when it refers not to scale but to purpose. It had been built for one thing, to serve as the location for a meeting between two civilizations that had been, in their different ways, moving toward this meeting for 67 years. The date of the meeting had been set in the framework Elena had brought back from Baikonur on the 8th of January 2000. It had been said in the original timetable on the metal plate that a 10-year-old girl had read in a secure facility in 1978 for the 12th of June 2030. June 12th had been chosen for a reason that the timetable did not explain, but that Elena had understood when she read the coordinates aloud. It was the anniversary of the day that Valentina Tereshkova had given birth to Elena. The 8th of June, 1964, a month off in the timetable. But Elena had always thought of this as a gesture rather than a date, in the way that a person might choose to hold a celebration not on the exact anniversary, but on the day that felt right. It felt right. The delegation that arrived at the Mo station on the morning of the 12th of June 2030 traveled in a vessel that the station's external cameras recorded from the moment it appeared, which was again in the instantaneous way that the objects always appeared, present where they had not been, without passage, without transition. The vessel was larger than the station by a considerable margin, but it matched the station's orbit precisely and held its position with the effortless, intention-like stillness that had characterized every craft of its kind since the one Valentina had observed at 350 meters in June of 1963. The human delegation on the Mo station consisted of 12 people selected through a process that had involved every nation with a seat at the Geneva table and several that had joined the framework in the intervening years. There were scientists, a historian, a linguist, a philosopher, 2 heads of state, a physician, and a poet. Included because Elena, who had designed the selection criteria, had insisted that a civilization should be represented at the most important meeting in its history by someone whose job was to attend to what things mean. Elena herself stood at the center of the delegation. She was 66 years old, her hair was gray, and she wore it simply in the way she wore everything, without performance, without concession to what the occasion might seem to demand. She was dressed in dark clothing. She held nothing in her hands. The connection between the two vessels was established through a docking mechanism that the Tereshkova 1 mission had tested and that worked as designed without difficulty. And then the door opened. Formal record of the meeting of the 12th of June 2030 is a document of 140 pages, translated into 47 languages, that has been studied in every major university on Earth in the years since its release. It covers the procedural aspects of the meeting, the frameworks established, the commitments made, the timetable agreed upon for the next phase of what is now called, in the official language of the relationship, the ongoing conversation. But the document that most people have read, and that has been reproduced more widely than any other text of the 21st century, is not the formal record. It is a personal account written by the poet who was part of the delegation. She was 29 years old and came from Lagos and had been selected because her work, which had been read by one of the framework committee members, had a quality that the committee described as the ability to be precise about things that resist precision. She wrote her account the day after the meeting by hand, in a notebook she had brought for exactly this purpose. She wrote about the chamber in which the meeting took place, neither the human station's interior nor the visitor's vessel, but a space that had been prepared between the two, a room that existed at the intersection, which had a quality of light she compared to the light just after a storm has passed and before the world has fully remembered its ordinary colors. She wrote about the moment the delegation from the other civilization entered the room. She did not describe their appearance in detail. Not because she lacked words, but because she wrote that the appearance was not the significant thing. that the mind's instinct to process the visual information first was, in that moment, simply overridden by something else, something that she called the quality of their attention, which she described as the most complete attention she had ever experienced directed toward her, toward all of them, with the specific warmth of recognition, not of individuals, but of humanity, the way you might recognize a song you have not heard for a long time and be glad to hear it again. The leader of the visiting delegation spoke first. The words were rendered into Russian, English, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, French, Hindi, Portuguese, and Swahili simultaneously, through a translation system that was one of the technical contributions of the framework years. The leader looked at Elena and then at the human delegation as a whole and said, "The poet wrote these words 3 times in her notebook, once in each of the first 3 languages she knew, as if she needed to hold them in multiple forms to keep them from slipping. We have waited a long time for this room, not with impatience, with the kind of waiting that is also a form of respect, the recognition that some things cannot be rushed without being damaged, and that the most important arrivals are the ones that happen at exactly the right moment." A pause, then, "Transmit to your mother our gratitude. She was a very brave girl." Valentina watched it from her apartment in Moscow. She was 93 years old. She sat in her chair by the window, the same chair she had sat in for 30 years of mornings, with the television on the low table she had moved to face her chair for this occasion. Elena had offered to bring her to the Mo station, had offered to arrange whatever was needed, had said, with the patient persistence of a daughter who knows when to push and when to wait, that she could be there, that it was possible, that there would be people to help. Valentina had said no. She had said it kindly and without ambiguity, in the way she said things that were decided. She said she would watch from home. She said that was the right place for her. She watched the door open. She watched the delegation from the other civilization enter the room. She watched Elena stand at the center of the human delegation, her daughter, 66 years old, gray-haired and composed, the bridge she had always been, and she watched the light in that room between 2 vessels in orbit above the Earth. She heard the words that the leader of the visiting delegation said. She heard her own name in the form, "your mother." She sat with that for a moment. Then she looked out the window at the Moscow morning, gray and ordinary and specific, the courtyard below where something grew in summer, the rooftops beyond it, the sky above the rooftops that she had been looking at in one form or another since she was a child, drawing pictures in Yaroslavl with no father, and a loom waiting for her, and a parachute club that met on weekends on the flat fields outside the city. She said it to the room, to the empty apartment, to whoever might be listening, which was no one and perhaps everyone, with the quiet certainty of a person who has carried something enormous for a long time and has finally, on a June morning in her 94th year, set it down. "I fulfilled my mission," she said. Outside, the Moscow sky was the color of everything that comes after, and above it, in a room between worlds, the conversation that had begun with 47 minutes of silence above the curve of the Earth was finally, fully, beautifully out loud.